Yes, thank you very much. Technology is hard. Okay, so I am excited to be here, and I'm also painfully aware that I am the last thing standing between you and food. So I will keep that in mind during the whole time. It is my second time speaking at DevOps Days Oslo. In 2016, I made dad jokes about DevOps for half an hour. And today I'll be talking about the environment. I will take you on a journey. I'll start with a short personal story. Then we'll talk about the deep shit we've gotten ourselves into as a species. We will move on to taking responsibility and to mental models that can help us act on that responsibility. We will look at data both about machines and people. And later on, we will strike a more positive and practical tone. We will look at realistic things we can do as technologists to tackle the global climate crisis on a local scale. So let's start. I haven't always worked in IT, like Lande introduced me already. So after pivoting to technology, I struggled as to what value I could bring into the field. And I eventually figured out that my experiences of working in non-governmental organizations, working for society, have made it easier for me to focus on the non-technological aspects of our work. And it's not that I am better or more ethical than others. It is just that I spent years exercising that particular muscle. And now thinking about sustainability of tech processes is kind of like muscle memory. So that's all. And I think we need more people like me in Western tech, more people who come to technology from different fields, more people who are used to receiving the short end of the stick when it comes to technology. And I'm here today because I want to share that slightly different perspective. We are living in times of crisis. And even though our world is safer than ever and richer than ever, we are facing catastrophic changes on a global scale. And overcoming them requires a historically unprecedented level of cooperation. And as you're aware, if you're watching the news, that part is not going so well, but we will not get into the details of why. We'll get into some data, since we're a data-driven bunch. Let's look at data to see how bad it actually is. So it is hard to precisely calculate our impact on the environment, so all the numbers I'm going to use here are estimates. And the purpose is to show the scale. So according to calculations by Jens Malmudin and Dag Lunden, who work in Ericsson and Telia respectively, when we only look at data centers and enterprise networks, their estimated yearly energy consumption is around 245 terawatt hours. To put this into perspective, that's more energy consumption than countries like Poland, Iran, Australia, or Mexico use in a year. When you add networks related to information and communications technologies on top of that, for example, mobile networks, you need to add another 220 terawatt hours. And those two numbers combined exceed the yearly energy consumption of countries like France or the United Kingdom. And these numbers will only be growing. More of us own more than one device. And we're also in the middle of the trend of treating everything as a service. So in other words, if your smart toaster is connected to the internet, that traffic is going to generate greenhouse gases. And don't even get me started about Bitcoin mining. But it might still be hard to conceptualize how big a number, 245 terawatt hours, is. So let's try putting this into perspective even more. And once again, we will operate on averages. So let's make some assumptions that we're going to plant trees to offset those emissions, and that those 245 terawatt hours translate to more or less 110 megatons of CO2 equivalent. And let's also make sure that the trees have enough space to grow, because bigger trees absorb more CO2 than smaller trees. Okay, so let's imagine Tokyo, a city of over 9 million people, spanning over the area of almost 2,200 square kilometers. Oslo is 450 square kilometers by comparison. Now let's take 1 million trees per 10 square kilometers. That is 220 million trees, and let's plant them evenly over the area of Tokyo. Just trees, nothing else. Also painfully visible that I am not a designer, but an engineer right now. So we need to keep that area full of trees alive for at least 20 years so that those trees can absorb all the carbon. And all of that effort, it would have to be made just to offset 1 year's worth of emissions by the IT sector. And if we want to cut that time in half, down to 10 years, because we don't have that much time, we need to more than double the number of trees, because smaller trees absorb less CO2. And we haven't even taken into account of setting any emissions we've already done. This is from today to the future. So we would have to repeat that process every year. And all of this coordination and all of this effort would have to be done by an industry that cannot even agree on one JavaScript framework. So I hope it's clear to you after this crude data visualization that it makes way more sense to lower our carbon impact than it is to simply offset it. I'm guessing some of you might be thinking right now that this work means taking business risks and that our companies will never accept taking those risks. And a lot of companies are conservative when it comes to taking risks. And that's understandable from a business perspective. And many of them think about the initially increased cost tied to changing processes and switching up things. And they find it unacceptable, or they just don't see an added business benefit. But when you look at consumer surveys, and I looked at surveys from a few different countries, they all paint a uniform picture. Consumers care about the environment, and there is a growing recognition of the climate crisis. Just to give you a sample. Over half of the people in Norway choose the more sustainable option when they're shopping. In another study, 2/3 of consumers said they want companies to be transparent about their practices and supply chains so that they can make informed choices. Almost 3 out of 4 millennials would pay more for sustainable products, and so on. And these surveys focus on food and tangible products. But why would people have different opinions about applications and websites they're using? Our users want us to help them be environmentally friendly, and we are not going to lose customers because we go on a journey to lower our carbon footprint. On the contrary. And the last thing our users want is for us to stand in their way. They want us to help them make more informed and more ethical choices. And I could stand here for the rest of the day and talk about the benefits for your business, but the truth is, in this day and age, there are more pressing reasons to fight for climate change than business opportunities. So, it is easy to become overwhelmed by the size of the crisis we are facing and by the plethora of potential actions we can take in order to lower our environmental footprint. And the first things that come to our minds might not be the ones that are going to change, that are going to bring the most environmental benefit. For example, your first idea might be quitting the use of single-use cups in your office because you walk past that coffee machine every day and you see those cups. And don't get me wrong, that would be a good change, but having a way to reason about also what is not visible helps us find other things that have more consequences that influence the climate more in a negative way. And we can use mental models for that. So there's this Green Web Foundation, which is a non-governmental organization that works towards a low-carbon internet. And they built a series of mental models that they publish on their website, and I think they are a great starting point. And today we'll use one of those models. It's called Platform Packets Process, to reason about our applications in our tech stack. We will go through each part of this model and ask some questions and share some ideas. We will start with the platform. So the platform part is simple. It is the environmental cost of the servers and the infrastructure used to run your application. And this can be broken down further into two ways, into two things. Where you run your workload, and the second thing, how efficient you are at running it. Does that make sense so far? Cool. I'll start with a story, how change in this aspect can look in practice. Finn decided to move to the cloud some time ago, and what followed was an evaluation period of different cloud providers because we wanted to make an informed choice. And we had a checklist which we followed, and a sustainability evaluation was on that checklist, and the idea came very early on from the tech department and was welcome every step of the way, mostly with reactions, oh, I should have thought of that, that's a good idea. And that evaluation was taken into account when we were making our choice in the end. So it's possible. And what we found during that evaluation, and I'm going to go through this shortly because Pia already talked about this yesterday during her Ignite. What we found was that different cloud providers have different approaches to sustainability. Some build data centers that are significantly more efficient when it comes to power usage. Some have a policy to use renewable energy. Some heavily reuse server components inside their data centers to reduce harmful electronic waste. While others, allegedly, changed their mind on sustainability goals once they felt that that will be attractive to the oil and gas industry. So it's important to ask yourself a question, how sustainable is your cloud provider? And if you don't use the cloud, if you like data centers, you might be positively surprised that carbon-neutral data centers exist. A few can be found in Scandinavian countries, but also all over the world, like in places like India. And once again, do your research, and no one will hide the fact that they are sustainable. So let's consider, let's ask some more questions about the physical infrastructure that our company runs on. So if you can't, for some reason, can't change your cloud provider, maybe you can switch to a region that's going to be powered by renewable energy, and there are maps, electricity maps that help you figure that out if the provider doesn't provide that information. And if you can switch your cloud provider or a data center, do choose one that is powered by renewable energy, or just not by burning coal. And remember that even though you use renewable energy, it doesn't mean that you can be wasteful, because that even though the energy is renewable, it still carries an environmental cost with it. And whichever infrastructure you run on, make sure you clean it up periodically. That also has an added financial benefit. And unused virtual machines or services can be found in most systems. Let's move on to how our applications are running. So the way we design our infrastructure systems today is becoming outdated. We treat infrastructure as a very rigid thing. But we have modern abstraction layers available to us, and these open new possibilities and make our systems more flexible and more dynamic. Consider this graph. This pattern should be painfully recognizable to any infrastructure person among us. What does it show? Let's zoom in. It shows average CPU utilization here of a Kubernetes cluster over a typical week. So what's the highest number there? 35%. Looks like there is quite a margin left here for Black Friday, the holiday season, any sudden server deaths, or DDoS attacks. But this means that this cluster's CPUs are painfully idle most of the time. And this is a pattern we see everywhere. We buy infrastructure thinking for the future and thinking we're smart by planning ahead, but what we are really doing is we are burning coal for nothing most of the time when we're not using it. And according to the United States Data Center Energy Usage Report, inactive servers represent between 10 to 30% of servers in American data centers. So remember those 220 million trees that we have to plant? Imagine having to plant 20 million trees less if we could just switch those unused servers off. These are traffic profile graphs made by the Green Web Foundation. So a yellow rectangle is a resource unit. On the left, this resource unit is going to be a server. And on the right, it's going to be a CPU cycle, for example. So if we used smaller servers and we're better at scaling horizontally, or even switched to serverless, and left the scaling of the infrastructure to cloud providers, and they're going to be better at this than us. We can drastically increase our resource utilization and lower the amount of wasted resources. And of course, changing the underlying architecture of mature product might not be unattainable. But if you're just starting, serverless might be an idea that is worth seriously considering when you think about the environment. And we need to keep this in mind, that each CPU cycle, each megabyte of RAM, each terabyte of storage carries with itself an environmental cost. So let's think about the efficiency of our applications. Are we caching everything that we can? Whatever is immutable can becomes cacheable. So here we can save on traffic. Maybe our database calls could use some optimization because they can get quite resource heavy. Are we deserializing data needlessly? Maybe JSON is not the best idea. Maybe it makes sense to switch to a binary format instead. Maybe if you use the JVM, maybe Graal VM, which is a modern, efficient, language-agnostic virtual machine, would be a better choice for you. How about you drop Java completely and write whatever is possible in a more efficient language like Go, Rust, or C if you're a masochist? I'm sorry. And have you thought about making threads obsolete and switching to coroutines? And however small you think your Docker image is, it can be smaller. Let's move on to the second part of the model, of the mental model, which is packets. So everything we use that other people own, apart from our infrastructure. So the first thing that might come to mind is the one that can be quite impactful, which is unused dependencies. You probably have them in your project, and each time you build your project, you need to fetch it from the internet. Think of Maven, downloading half the internet every time you build. There's probably some stuff there that you could clean up. Try figuring out if there are multiple alternatives for a package repository or for a hosted CI/CD tool. Try figuring out what they are running on, and maybe there is a more sustainable option, or maybe you are already using the more sustainable option. Some people think that GitHub Actions are a good idea if you have a simple pipeline, because if you host your code there, your build runs in the same place and you save on traffic. And whenever you're choosing a new technology, get used to making an environmental evaluation of each option. So that brings us to the third part of the model, which is the process. This is where the single-use cups would fit. And it's everything related to the organizational part of developing your software. So let's look at some random numbers under this controversial headline. So from the left, sending 4 people to a European conference means emitting around 3 tons of CO2 just because of the flights. And a lot of conferences these days are being recorded and live streamed, just like this one. And some conferences are too big to have a lively hallway track. So you're not really losing much. Let's take a company of 200 people. If we skipped meat, fish, and seafood at every lunch for a month and only served vegetarian food, we would save almost 6 tons of CO2. And if the same company started switching off their laptops when they leave the office, that would save around 2 tons of CO2 in a month. And there are so many things you can do that are related to the process. And let's look at what we haven't mentioned yet. So first of all, your company can make it easier for every employee to travel sustainably, either by providing public transport tickets or save bike parking, or both. Your company can be friendlier towards remote work and revise the travel policy and introduce more telecommuting. You can change your company's device policy to replace devices a bit less often. And there's probably a lot of work equipment, not only laptops, that doesn't have to be on at night. And if you're feeling overwhelmed still, or just started that feeling just started creeping in, that's a perfectly normal reaction. There's a lot of things you can do. How do you start the process of change in your company? The climateaction.tech initiative has a very handy article on its website where they describe proven steps that they've seen work again and again. And in short, the thing you should start with is creating a public general sustainability statement with what your company is hoping to achieve. And that creates a feeling of shared purpose. It also doesn't contain all the implementation details, which means it's easier for people to agree on it. And it's a great starting point that you can use later on. The next step is gathering data, brainstorming ideas, and agreeing on a process to move forward. And gathering data involves making an analysis of your company's operations, and you can do that on varying level of rigorousness. What is most important is that you keep the same framework for evaluating through the whole process, so that you compare, as Americans say, apples to apples. And the third important step is to have an organizational role that can remove obstacles and keep the momentum going, whether it's a sustainability officer or a sustainability task force. It's important also because we remove the risk of having a diffusion of responsibility. And it is dangerous to go alone, so it's important to find allies. And at Finn, we have a weekly academy where we make presentations or workshops, and I held such an academy a while ago and used some of the ideas my colleagues had in the presentation here. And I saved the best idea for last. I hope we won't have to reach a point where it's necessary to ration the internet. And it all depends on us. And however difficult it might look now, please don't give up. It is possible to lower a whole company's, however big it is, environmental footprint, and there are people and companies that have already done it. I collected some links to useful resources I mentioned today, and I'm going to tweet the slides to this talk later, so you can have a look and read more. And awareness about the influence technology is having on the environment is still quite low. So we all need to do our part in spreading data, spreading ideas, and spreading success stories. And we need to take matters in our own hands. And each and every one of us has a responsibility towards society, towards nature, and towards the future. And sure, climate changes are a natural phenomena, but the speed of changes this time, that's purely on us. And there is no time to prepare billions of people for what's coming. So each and every one of us has to become a little bit uncomfortable and has to put in work. Otherwise, the future is grim. And we cannot wait for governments to change laws or for big businesses to show remorse. And actually, most of us work in tech companies, so we are already that part of that big business. So we can impact our workplaces and introduce real changes that are going to create lasting change. And this is our chance to go beyond the small individual actions that can get frustrating and in the grand scheme of things are not going to save the world by themselves. And if you have any questions, ideas, or feedback, I'll be around here for the rest of the day. You can also write me on Twitter or on LinkedIn. And thank you very much for listening to what I had to say today.
Marta, you have time for some questions.
Okay. So we actually have time for
questions, if we have any. Yeah, yes. Please.
You mentioned like 6-hour workday. How would that have any effects on the environment?
Okay. So the question was how a 6-hour workday would have, what impact would it have on the environment? That's a good question. Well, you save on resources by shortening the amount of time that people work during a day. It means that they can turn off their equipment earlier. You can turn off all the lights in the office earlier, and so on. So it kind of decreases the amount of resource usage in your office. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Cool. Thanks. Any other questions? Yeah, they're in the back. We haven't measured our environmental impact of Fin yet. We're only beginning this journey. Fin is kind of a bit special because already our product itself helps people participate in the circular economy. So we've mostly been focusing on that, but we're slowly starting to look more into the environmental impact that we have. The cloud evaluation, for example, was one of those first things. Does that make sense? Great.
No? Okay. Thank you very much, Marta.
Thank you very much.